going to do today is we are going to take a look at what I believe is our final topic in perception, which has to do with the LA-MOAD Theory, which is a way of understanding metaphoric pictures. So if you recall our last objection in our picture definitions, when we finally got to Gibson in 1971 with the pictures as information theory, one of the big objections to that was that of metaphoric pictures. So metaphoric pictures are representing things that never occurred in the external world, and yet we understand the metaphor. So we need a final aspect of these theories to understand what is it exactly that we're doing when we perceive metaphorical pictures. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at just the idea of metaphors. We're going to start off with linguistic metaphors, and then we're going to talk about visual metaphors. And then we'll take a look at ways of analyzing pictures. So Gibson mentioned the theory of pictures as sources of information. So we're going to take a look at one way of sort of quantifying those sources of information, and that's the idea of pictorial devices. And we'll define some that are literal, we'll define some that are metaphorical. And then we're going to take a look at some work that I did here with a graduate now of IUSB, Alicia Horvath, back in 2016. And that work led to the formulation of the LA-MOAD theory, and we'll talk all about what that is. So let's start off with the idea of metaphors and the idea of literal statements and metaphorical statements. So we'll start off with a literal one. So if somebody told you, oh, the grass is green, we all know what that means. We've been taught what that means since elementary school. This is an example of a literal statement. This is literally telling you that the grass is actually green. There's grass out there, it's green. It's meant to be interpreted exactly as it is. This is an example of a literal statement. A metaphorical statement, on the other hand, would be something like, John has a heart of stone, or he has a heart of stone. If you say he has a heart of stone, we understand that this is not to be taken literally, right? This is not to be taken in a way that means, oh my gosh, he has a heart of stone, how is he living, what kind of medical marvel is this? No, we understand that he has a heart of stone is meant to be taken metaphorically. It's not actually saying the truth of the matter out there, but it's giving you information about this individual. So when I say he has a heart of stone, everybody in here knows that this person is not warm and inviting. This person is cold and distant, and we've communicated that information with this metaphoric statement. So, when somebody tells you life is a journey, usually you don't get up and leave because you want to live life. You understand that this is a metaphor. It's not an actual trip that you're taking. So these are all examples of linguistic metaphors that we are able to process and we're able to understand. And my work that I do has to do with the same idea, but visual. So visual metaphors and literal visual images. That's what I analyze to see how our minds decode that information and use that information to perceive these images. So an example of a literal picture would be this individual right here. So this individual, this is a picture of a person running, and this is a literal picture of them. And one of the ways that you can identify what is literal and what is not in a picture is to identify things that do actually happen in the real world when that action or when that image was taking place. So if I was to take a look at this image here and start analyzing it, I know it's a literal image of an individual running because when you run, your hands and arms actually go into that position. That is something that does happen when you're running. Your legs actually go into that position. That's another thing that happens when you're running. And then finally, he is off the ground. And the definition of running, if you've ever seen speed walking competitions. One of the definitions for running is that your 2 feet are off the ground at any point in time. If you're speed walking, you have to have 1 foot on the ground at all times. He has 2 feet off the ground. That literally happens when you're running. So this is a literal image of a person running. And important for today's look at our research, this is an image of a person in motion. So when you perceive this image, you perceive this person, you kind of directly picked up that this person is in motion, right? So we've captured them in a moment in time, but you know that they were moving. So that's another thing that we're looking at, even though this image is stationary. This is a static image. It hasn't changed for the last 2 minutes that I've been talking about it. Even though it's stationary, you know, you perceive that this person is in motion. You don't just hypothesize that they're in motion. It's not just top down. You can perceive the information that indicates, yes, this individual is in motion. You can contrast that with these individuals who are clearly not in motion. So we're going to concentrate on pictures that depict motion, and we're going to take a look at literal pictures that have literal information that indicates that a person is in motion. We're going to take a look at metaphorical pictures that use metaphorical devices to indicate motion. So for example, here we see a metaphorical device of multiple images. So most people, when they see this image, they will not perceive this as triplets playing together, and one triplet fell, and then the other one is in the process of falling, and the third one is about to fall. They usually perceive this as one individual before falling, during falling, and then after falling, and that's metaphorical. Multiple images is a metaphorical device because at no point during a fall do you split into 3 different entities, in that fall. So you don't go to multiples when you fall. So that's a metaphorical instance, and this is what Gibson's theory had a problem with, because we pick up that metaphorical information even though this situation never happened in the real world. So another example of multiple images is this individual here jumping. So we don't see this, as the amazing bouldering quadruplets, right? We see this as one individual at 4 stages of jumping, and you don't have to be told that, right? Most of you immediately, as you saw that, picked up the idea that, okay, this is one person in motion. So once again, we have metaphorical information that we can process that you've never didn't have to really think about very hard. Number 2, we have motion that you're perceiving in a static medium. So that's what we're going to be looking at. How do we process that so that we can understand that this is not quadruplets, this is one individual, and then how do we take that information in our minds and basically put it all together? That's going to be the focus for this analysis. So we'll start off with our first step. And the first step is that we need a definition of pictorial devices, and we're going to need a definition for metaphoric and literal devices. So literal pictorial devices, and this comes from Kennedy, who was my supervisor, and his supervisor was Gibson. So most of this is going to be very ecological psychology based. So we need literal pictorial device definition. We need metaphorical pictorial devices definition. This move right here, just for all of your future psychology endeavors, sometimes you go into an area and everybody has one definition of what certain things are. Other times you go into an area and people have multiple definitions of what something is. If they ever have multiple definitions, you need to define it and make sure that everybody knows what your definition is. So I remember when I was presenting this research at a conference, right after my presentation, I had 4 or 5 people come up and say, oh, what you're calling metaphors, those aren't actually metaphors. And according to my definition, they are metaphors. But according to their definition, they weren't metaphor. So this is one of those kind of challenges. We're dealing with an area, an idea that doesn't have a lot of agreement, but one way to do that, one way to tackle that, is to just make sure that right at the get-go you're like, okay, this is what I mean as a metaphor. You might disagree, but this is our working definition. So what we're going to do is we're going to just define it. Literal pictorial devices, these are pieces of your picture. Pictorial devices are strategies and pieces of your picture, and literal ones represent what is actually in the 3D scene, what is actually out there in the real world. Metaphorical devices, they're anything that depicts what is not in the 3D scene. So they're anything on your picture, any part of your picture that depicts something that doesn't occur in the real world. Literal pictorial devices, these devices, and this is the phrase that Kennedy was using, these are devices that follow the rules. So they follow the rules of perspective, they follow the rules of projection, they follow the rules of perspective geometry. These are the ones that kind of just follow those rules, and they're used to kind of as the basis of our understanding of pictures. And because we know these rules, the metaphorical pictorial devices are the ones that break those rules. So much like in linguistic metaphors, the grass is green follows linguistic rules. It follows the fact that it matches up to the actual occurrence in the real world. But he has a heart of stone breaks the rules, right? It's technically a lie. He does not have a heart of stone. And if you know the rules, you can sense when the rules are broken. And if you sense when the rules are broken, you can understand the extra information that's being communicated. You can apprehend the metaphor. So that's the metaphorical pictorial devices. It's not in the 3D scene. Those multiple toddlers were not in the scene. Those multiple jumpers were not in the scene. And it's breaking the rules as a pictorial device. So once again, the runner did happen in the real world. At some point, this runner was off the ground. At some point, this runner's arms were like that. So these are all literal occurrences. Incidentally, one of the pictorial devices that people often disagree on, whether it's metaphorical or not, is blur. Because blur does occur in your visual system in the real world. So we've all had instances where we couldn't see something because it was blurry. But on the other hand, the world is not blurry. So according to our definition, blurry would be a metaphorical device. But according to other people's, blurry is not a metaphorical device. So just so you know that, we're not going to talk about blur though. We're not going to go there this time. So that was literal. This is metaphorical, again, because it's depicting three toddlers. Three toddlers never occurred in the real world. Three toddlers did not fall down. So this is a metaphorical device. It breaks the rules. So what we did in our study is we wanted to do a historical analysis. We wanted to take a look at existing artifacts and figure out what successful artists were doing to communicate with their audience. So just the same way that very recently a new cave of cave art was found, a new cave of ancient paintings was found, and psychologists and anthropologists got really excited because they were able to infer the cognitive abilities of these ancient peoples based on what they drew. We can take a look at current artists and infer our cognitive abilities based on what they draw, because it's like a physical symbol system. They are delineating certain information into a picture, and then that information is being read by interpretation. Both of those have to be there. So we can do that with a historical analysis. And we wanted to look at successful artists because we wanted to make sure that we were looking at pictures that could be understood. So anybody can just throw paint on a canvas, and you won't understand what it is, and usually you won't buy it, or you won't want to see very much of it. But if you can communicate with a picture, then that picture might become popular. So looking at popular pictures meant that we were looking at artifacts that we knew were successful, that we knew communicated successfully. So we were going to take a look at these pictures, and we're going to see what combinations they used in their pictures, what combinations of pictorial devices. So this is where the hunt for literal and metaphorical pictorial devices began. And as it turns out, not a lot of metaphorical devices in the Renaissance. So in this Birth of Venus over here, even though it's depicting a mythological occurrence, it is depicting this in literal form. So if there were angels flying, this is what the angels would look. They would be off the ground, their wings would be flapping. If there was a giant seashell, this is what the seashell would look like. The closest we get to metaphor here is the wind that's coming out of this angel's mouth here. So this actually mythical, but literal pictorial devices. Mona Lisa was out because, number one, all literal devices. And then we also wanted to look at motion. So Birth of Venus has motion, but no metaphorical devices. Mona Lisa, not even in motion, just kind of sitting there. We took a look, we were thinking about doing maybe abstract art, but abstract art we chose not to, sometimes because it's just not representational. So we really wanted art that could depict things in the real world, and then also could depict metaphorical. So this is not representational, it's not supposed to depict anything. And then we also wanted images that were readily understandable, because we wanted to tap into how do our minds work? How do our minds naturally work? So this image over here, let's see the title. Yeah, so does anybody know what they're looking at over here? Does anybody recognize? You've seen it before. We actually saw it last class. All right. Yeah, I can't see it either. It's called Dynamism of a Soccer Player. So that's a soccer player. Now the fact that you looked at that and didn't say, oh, a soccer player, means that you didn't pick up enough information to have that perception. You couldn't take a look at this and process the information that this artist was using enough to reach that perception of a soccer player. So the information that we use to perceive certain depictions, just not present in something as abstract as this. And then my favorite example of this is this image right here. So does anybody know what they're looking at? Yep.
I think it's someone walking down the stairs.
Yes, it is somebody walking down the stairs. Actually, it's a nude person walking down the stairs. So this is a very famous one called Nude Descending a Staircase. And if you could process this, then I might be contacted by HR later today with some complaints from various students. But it just doesn't. Nobody looks at this and sees nude descending a staircase. All right. I'll put this another way. I went to an all-guy high school. There were a lot of pictures on the inside of their locker doors. Nobody had this picture on the inside of their locker door because you just don't. You can't decode it. You can't see it. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to find images where there was motion. We wanted to find images that represented things that occurred in the real world. But we also wanted to find images that could use metaphorical devices and use them often enough that we would have data and examples to look at. And lo and behold, all the comics that I read as a child came back, and those are the images that we used. So comic book art oftentimes has a lot of motion, has a lot of metaphorical devices, like these action lines here, has a lot of literal representation, has people represented, cars represented. So we went to comic books to start analyzing the images that comic books are using in order to communicate motion. And that was the other reason that we went to comic books, because not only do they use literal and metaphorical devices a lot, but they also depict motion a lot. So there is a lot of motion in comic books. So here we have an image of the Flash running. Here we have another image of the Flash running. And as you can see, tons of literal devices. So position of the legs, position of the body, position of the arms. Tons of metaphorical devices. We got action lines. We have multiples. We only looked at various motions like running. We didn't look at hitting, but it's very kind of interesting that this never happens when you punch somebody, right? There's no flash of light when you punch somebody, but you know exactly where this person's face was when the flash's fist was right there, right? So these are all things that we can kind of encode, and we wanted to see, how do artists put these images together? How do they combine these? So if you're a successful artist, like one of the most famous artists for the Flash, Carmine Infantino, how do you combine literal devices and metaphorical devices to make something that is easily understandable by your audience? So that's the last thing we really wanted. Comic books are clearly easy to understand for audiences. They're often written for a wide variety of ages. So we took a look at that, and what we did is we basically took a look at images like this famous one. This wasn't part of the experiment, but like this famous one, just to indicate, of Carmine Infantino and how I draw the Flash. And we basically took a look at images of motion and then coded each image for the devices that were used in the image. So if it had multiple images, that would be a metaphorical device. If it had action lines, that would be a metaphorical device. Posture of the limbs, that would be a literal device. And we literally went through about 400 covers and coded for motion in each of those covers. All right, so the stimuli that we used 400 comic book covers from the Silver Age of comics. And it is really kind of interesting, just a real quick aside. If you ever take a look at art history, you'll know that art styles change as you go, through the years. And it's interesting that in comic book art history as well, what goes on the cover has changed dramatically. So back in the Silver Age, back in those 1956 to 1980, back in the Bronze Age, which would have been the 70s and the 80s, the covers were very dynamic. They were very filled with motion. People were moving all over the place. There was a lot of motion being depicted. If you pick up a cover today, a lot of people are standing still. It's almost like comic book artists went back to the Renaissance and just started painting people in poses and standing around, sitting around, and basically not moving at all. So we kind of chose an area where we knew, an era that we knew we were going to find a lot of motion in. And gratifyingly, we've looked at other eras and the same kind of results occur. But these days, it is less common to find a depiction of motion on covers. So thank goodness we have access to the interiors of these comics where motion is still shown. All right. So for this first study, we wanted to focus on one motion. So we were like, let's just choose one that we can take a look at, see how it's depicted. And the motion that we chose was running. So for these 400 covers, we went through each cover and we took a look at, was anybody depicted that was running? So for this cover here of Captain America, we have Captain America running, we got Namor running, we have just about everybody running except for the Wasp, and she's flying. So in this case, we would analyze what are the pictorial devices that were being used to show that, for example, Captain America is running. So we have Captain America running here. Here we have Quicksilver running around Spider-Man. So once again, we would code for literal devices, and we would code for metaphorical devices. And in this case, you can see metaphorical action lines. You can see multiples here. And you can also see literal devices like positions of the arms and legs. So 400 covers. The pictorial devices that we looked at 5. So we wanted to limit our search, otherwise this just would not have been cognitively possible. So we used 3 literal and 2 metaphorical devices, and this was based on previous research. So just to kind of give you a schematic of what those look like, this is an example of a picture of a person running with none of the 5 devices. So this is, hopefully you will agree, a horrible picture of a person running. Because when you look at this, you say to yourself, it doesn't look like they're running, right? So it's not a good picture of somebody running. And the reason is because the pictorial devices that indicate running have been completely removed, right? So this is an example of no pictorial devices. This individual doesn't really look like they're running. So first pictorial device we looked for is orientation of the body. So when you run, you have a forward lean, right? Very few people run like this, right? Usually when you run, you have a forward lean. So this position of the body, this forward lean, that was one pictorial device, one literal pictorial device, because when you run, you actually lean forward. So that was the first literal device we looked at, was the person leaning forward in the picture. Next device that we looked at, and this one is very important, posture of the arms and the legs. So when you run, you have to move your arms and your legs. So in any picture that we saw where a person was running, were they moving or were they depicted as having their arms and legs in this running position? The last literal device that we looked at was ground plane. So when you're running, you are literally off of the ground plane. At the very least, you have to have 1 foot off the ground plane. Because at no point when you run, it's like both feet on the ground. Running is 1 foot at a time, or basically jumping in the air. So those are the 3 literal devices that we looked at. The metaphorical devices that we looked at, first one was multiple images. So do they have those multiple cascading images indicating their direction of travel? And then the last one that we looked at was action lines. And the interesting thing about these 5 pictorial devices is that they can all be combined in any different combination. So you can put any 2 of them together and they won't contradict each other. You can put any 3 of them together and they won't contradict each other. You can put all 5 of them together and they're still fine. They don't, again, they don't contradict each other. They're systematic, if you will. So this is an example of all 5. So what we would do is we would find a picture of an individual running and we would just say, all right, let's count how many literal devices there are. So we have orientation of the body, that's 1. We got posture of the legs, that's 2. Off the ground plane, that's 3. So this would be 3 literal devices. And then how many metaphorical? We have multiple images, that's 1 metaphorical. We got action lines, that's 2 metaphorical. And every instance of running was classified according to that system. Any questions on that so far? All right. So just to give you some examples, for this image of Captain America, we have, so for Captain America running, we have 2 literal devices. So 1, we have posture, we have the position of the arms and the legs. 2, we have the ground plane. We have him off of the ground, clearly here. We did not code forward lean for this one. We did not code the orientation of the body as having occurred, because in this case, it's rather ambiguous. You might be leaning forward, you might not be leaning forward. So we had a criteria to determine when do we count these kind of borderline cases. And just in this case, he was not coded as having orientation. In terms of metaphorical devices, he doesn't have any. There's clearly no multiple images. There's clearly no action lines. So this would be a case of a 2 literal, 0 metaphorical image of a person running. On the other hand, Quicksilver over here, who's running, this is an indication of somebody who has orientation. So Quicksilver is clearly leaning forward, has posture, the arms and the legs are in running position. Off of the ground plane, at least 1 foot is off of the ground plane here. And then in terms of metaphorical, no multiples, right? They don't have multiple images, but we have action lines. So we have these metaphorical action lines indicating that Quicksilver is running. So this would be an example of a 3 metaphorical, 1 literal picture. All right, so we went back to our stimuli, and for each depicted motion, for each instance of running, we coded what the pictorial devices were. We both rated these so that we could see what our agreement was. Our inter-rater reliability, as they call it, was pretty high, and that was gratifying. And then what we found, again, we coded this in terms of how many metaphorical devices, how many literal devices were used, and how often those combinations occurred. So the thing to keep in mind before we get to this analysis is the idea that these devices were able to be combined in any way. So the artist had complete freedom to choose no devices if they wanted to. They could draw a picture of a person just standing there and say, this person's running. They could just choose one device if they wanted to. They could put two devices if they wanted to, 3 all the way up to 5. And importantly, any device could be combined with any other device. So they had the freedom of just doing all literal devices. Or they could do literal devices with one metaphorical device. Or they could do 2 metaphorical devices and no literal devices. There was nothing that was excluded. There was nothing that was impossible for them to depict with. So what we're going to see here is the result of artists who are successful, who have learned to communicate in a way that our minds understand. We're going to see what they do in order to communicate. So again, it's very important that we remember these are successful artists. These are professional comic book artists. And they got to that point because the pictures that they drew, when they showed it to somebody, that person said, oh yeah, I see it. That's Quicksilver running. Very easy to process. So they're not confusing. So let's see what combinations they use that indicates what combinations our minds use in order to process this type of information. All right, so the first thing we're going to see is we're looking at running. What we did is on the y-axis here, we had the frequency. So how many times did we find each of these combinations? And then on the x-axis here, we have the pictorial devices that were used. So the L stands for literal, the M stands for metaphorical, and the number of letters stand for the number of devices used. So this would be pictures that had one literal device. So you just showed the ground plane, or you just showed orientation. This would be one metaphorical device. This would be pictures that only had 2 literal devices, 3 literal devices, 1 literal, 1 metaphorical, 2 literal, 1 metaphorical, all the way up. This one over here, 2 metaphorical, all the way up to the ones that used multiple metaphoricals and the ones that used all 5 devices. So once again, we were looking at single devices. So we have orientation, we got posture, we got ground plane, we got multiple images, and we got action lines. So what combinations of these 5 devices do professional artists use? And then we can also have, as I mentioned, combinations. So 2 literal devices, for example, would be shown right here. So there's no ground plane. There's posture and there's orientation. That's 2 literal, 0 metaphorical. This is also 2 literal, 0 metaphorical. So we have orientation and ground plane, but no posture. Sorry, we got posture and ground plane, but no orientation. Here we have orientation and ground plane, but no posture. This would be 3 literal devices. We got orientation, we got posture, and we got ground plane. So that's an example of 3 metaphorical devices. So let's see what we're working with. So the first thing to take a look at, so I'll put up some data right now. All right, there you go. The first thing to notice is that they never used literal and metaphorical devices alone. So no artist ever just showed a picture with 1 literal device. No artist ever just used 1 metaphorical device. And that's a great indication that they just don't carry enough information. No device on its own has enough information to make a good picture, a high quality picture that depicts running. What about the combination of 2 literal and 3 literal devices? Well, we have that many instances of those types of pictures. So what we did to indicate how much a device was used is we took every single picture that showed running and we computed how much of a frequency do we need in order to be significantly above average? What frequencies do we need to be at an average amount? And then what frequencies do we need to be significantly below average? So the statistics we did on this, we won't go into, but anything that is blue, these dark blue bars, those are combinations that were used way more often than you would expect by chance, right? Those are combinations that were preferred by the artist, that were used way more often than we would have expected if these artists were just picking combinations randomly. The light blue ones, those are the ones that were used at a level that was average. That's what we would have expected if all of these categories were equally successful, if all of them were equally good at depicting motion. And then lastly, the white ones, these are the ones that artists avoided. So these are the ones that these artists have learned through their experience do not work as a communication. So, you know, I'll give you an example of this, things that don't work as communication. So hopefully, have people here seen Ocean's 11? Ever? Do we have anybody? No? Does anybody know English, Cockney rhyming, slang, things like that? No? All right, this is going to be a great example. There's a scene where, so it's a heist movie. It's very enjoyable. It's got Brad Pitt, it's got George Clooney, it's got Matt Damon, it's got just about everybody. But there was a scene where the team was in trouble. And one of the team members said that, oh, you know, yeah, we're in Barney. And they're all looking at him going, we're in Barney? What are you talking about? And he's like, Barney? Barney Rubble? Trouble? So he was trying to tell them we're in trouble. And he was using Cockney slang. He was using rhyming slang. He was using a code that prisoners use so they can make plans that the guards won't hear about, right? So he was using this way of communicating that just didn't work. And none of them got it. That's what the white areas are. The white bars are pictures that you try to communicate with, but they just don't work. So you avoid them, right? He never said we're in Barney again because he knew the people he was working with just didn't get it. So this right here doesn't even have a bar. This would have been white if it had anything. This, just a literal device one, just metaphorical device one, artists don't use that because they know that it just doesn't communicate. Artists are very fond, very preferred to use two literal devices, indicating that two literal devices carries enough information to communicate running, and then the three literal devices also carries enough information to communicate running. So that idea of pictures as information, this is confirmation that this is enough information, and this is enough information to depict running. All right, so the next one we're going to look at is one literal and one metaphorical. So that would be an image like that. So we have posture with action lines. Here we have orientation with action lines. Here we have multiples with ground plane. So these are all examples of one literal device and one metaphorical device. And when we take a look at how often that was used, we found, again, not. They avoided one literal and one metaphorical device because they know that that is not good. That's not going to communicate running to any comic book reader. All right, next up, we have two literal with one metaphorical. So examples of that, we have orientation and posture with multiples. Here we have posture and ground plane with action lines. So two literal and one metaphorical. How often was that used? Well, those were used at about average. So two literal and one metaphorical, three literal and one metaphorical. Artists did use this information. So not as much as the ones without metaphors, but at an average amount. So they did prefer, they weren't actively avoiding it. Two literal and one metaphorical, three literal and one metaphorical. All right, almost done. We got two metaphorical over here. That would be an image like that. And we won't spend too much time on this because nobody used it, right? So this two metaphorical devices doesn't communicate running. No artist drew with just those two metaphorical devices. And then lastly here, we have the three combinations that have multiple metaphorical devices. So these are the first combinations where there were two metaphorical devices being used. And you can see that it contains the very effective two literal devices and three literal devices, right? So it contains this, plus an added metaphor, which we already know is working because of this, these bars over here. So this would be an instance like here where we have all five of these devices all put together. So we took a look at how often these were used, and this was a surprising result. of this research because artists actively avoided them. Very few instances, in fact, only one out of the entire pool of running pictures used multiple metaphors. So these combinations with two metaphors were actually actively avoided. Artists did not use them as a form of communication because something about them just wasn't effective. Something about them just wasn't optimal for these artists. Any questions about the results? Yep.
Were any of the devices used more than others? I feel like posture would be used.
Yeah, posture was one that was used extensively. So in other studies of pictures of motion, you will find that different motions use different devices, more or less. Running is one that by far uses one the most, and that's posture. There was almost no picture that we found where posture wasn't included. We also looked at other ones like falling, flying, swinging, and jumping. And those ones had more of a mix. So it was really interesting that posture really dominated a lot of the results for running. But for other ones like falling, orientation dominated because you didn't need your arms in any position, but you definitely needed to be leaning back or leaning forward. So that's another kind of interesting aspect of this research is to see what information is used in different types of motion. Yep. Any other questions before we go to the implications of this? So again, very kind of clearly multiple linear devices preferred. Artists will use that. Literal devices with one metaphorical device, artists will use that. But multiple metaphorical devices, artists avoid it. Artists did not use that. Something about that was not optimal. So from this data, from this analysis, we came up with the idea that the way that literal devices work, the way that our minds process these literal devices, is in the following. So we have literal devices here, we got metaphorical devices here, and the way that our minds do this is we do not use solo devices. So solo devices on their own are not used by artists, and they're not used by our minds because they don't carry enough information. So artists know, and our minds process this information in a way that just one device is usually not enough to communicate a particular motion. For literal devices, if you add a single device to your picture, that improves your picture. So if you have no devices, but you add one device, that makes it better. If you got one device, but you add two devices, that makes it better. If you got two devices, but add three devices, that makes your picture better. So additional single devices are used. And for metaphorical devices, also additional single devices are used. Because remember that combination of two literal and one metaphorical, those kind of pictures were used. So far, our brains are processing, our minds are processing literal devices and metaphorical devices the same. However, the difference comes with multiple devices. For literal devices, multiple devices can be used. Every literal device you add adds more information, making your picture more easily understood, a better depiction. That's for literal devices. For metaphorical devices, multiple devices are not used. Artists do not use those. It's not that they can't draw them. It's not that they're not skilled enough. It's just that something about it is ineffective. Something about it is, as we're going to see, a waste of information. One metaphorical device is more than enough to communicate that information. So that is the key difference. And this is evidence here that our minds do process literal devices and metaphorical devices very differently. So they use different strategies for this. Metaphorical devices are not a type of, they're not in the same category as literal devices. It's not like there's just pictorial devices and then there's two subsets. Our data has shown that one of them gets added together, one of them does not, they're two separate entities processed in two different ways. All right, so that's where we came up with the LA-MOAD theory. So the LA-MOAD theory stands for Literal Devices, Additive, Metaphorical, One and Done theory. So we really wanted to have something that sounded like it was tasty like ice cream, so we had the LA-MOAD theory. And it shows that we have a fundamental difference in how we process literal and metaphorical information. At the very least, literal information is processed in a additive way, where additional literal devices will get added to the information that your mind is using, and that increases your understanding of the picture. However, metaphorical information is just one device. As soon as your mind processes that one device, adding additional devices doesn't do anything. It's almost like your mind will not process any more metaphorical information. Everything that can be accomplished with metaphorical information is accomplished with that first piece of metaphorical information. Adding additional ones will not do anything. And that's why a comic book artist who has to produce 22 pages plus a cover every single month and is probably working 10-hour days and cramping their arms and just having, deadlines to meet, they don't want to draw more than they need to. They want to draw enough that they can get the communication across, but they don't want to waste time drawing more than they need to. So they found out somehow through experience that you don't need to draw additional metaphorical information. Draw one device, add an action line, makes your picture look better. Add multiples to that action line, doesn't do anything. So they avoided those multiple images. So we're going to wrap this up with basically the same way that I was wrapping up all the definitions. So we just found that in general, literal devices are additive and metaphorical devices, they're one and done. Literal devices continually add to the quality of your picture. Metaphorical devices, the first one adds, the second ones don't do anything. Third one doesn't do anything. And interestingly, as soon as we discovered this, our minds went back to Carmine and Fantino, because if you remember the picture of the flash that he suggested when he was like, oh, this is how you draw the flash, notice that this violates the LA-MOAD theory that we just came up with. So there are violations of the LA-MOAD theory, and that's part of the research that we're doing right now. But importantly, and it's important to, this is a very important distinction, the idea here is that when he drew the flash leaning forward, he made the picture of the flash running better. When he then took the arms of the flash and legs of the flash and moved them into the correct orientation, he made the picture of the flash better. When he added in the multiple images, that metaphorical information, he made the picture of the flash better, more understandable, more convincing. However, according to the LA-MOAD theory, once he added in the action lines, that did nothing to increase the quality of the picture. It didn't make the picture worse, but that information is not making the picture better. That information is ignored by your mind. That information does not increase the quality of the picture, which is why if you're an artist trying to get the most impact out of the least amount of pictorial devices, you put in all the literal devices you can, but you ignore, but you only use one metaphorical device. And just to kind of wrap this up, we'll bring it back to linguistics. So this is something that we've seen in linguistics too, because if you take a look at the metaphors that we use in linguistics, they're usually one metaphor, right? Life is a journey, right? He has a heart of stone. We don't do things like Zap Brannigan here when he was talking about an attack. We don't say things, we don't mix our metaphors, right? We don't say, if we hit that bullseye, the rest of the dominoes should fall like a house of cards. Checkmate, right? We don't say that. We don't string together multiple metaphors, because just the same way that it doesn't make sense visually, it also just doesn't seem to make sense linguistically. All right, so are there any questions on this kind of research and what we looked at here today, the LA-MOAD theory? All right, so that's all that I wanted to cover for today. Just a reminder, this Saturday, my lab will be presenting not this research, but similar research on comic books. Specifically, we're going to be looking at gender issues in comics. If you're interested in watching that, I'm going to be tweeting out the real link. I just discovered how to do YouTube live streaming, so I'm going to be tweeting out the real link. So just watch that. If you're interested, 10:30 on Saturday, tune in and you can check it out. Other than that, we're done for the day.